And I'm going on with that theme. If you recall, Aaron Calder yesterday in his talk mentioned that the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphic was made more difficult by certain preconceptions about what it means to write and kind of ignoring the visual aspects of the script. And he very ominously mentioned that this misunderstanding continues in certain ways. And that is part of what I like to talk about here today. However, first, let's not get ahead of ourselves. My talk today is going to first go over the basic principles of the Egyptian scripts and the principles of the hieroglyphic layout. I'm going to define retrograde writing, explain how it was explained previously, tell you why I'm unhappy with these explanations, and then go over two case studies to show that my explanation is to be preferred. So the scripts of ancient Egypt very shortly. Of course, hieratic was the script that was first learned by scribes and was most often used day to day. It eventually developed and mostly taken over by Demotic in the first millennium BC. But the script I'm going to talk about is hieroglyphic, which could take on two forms, monumental and cursive. So I'm a big fan of the big red circle, so you'll have to bear with me. And it is within the hieroglyphic script that we see retrograde writing exclusively. So briefly on the layout and the orientation of hieroglyphic. In this talk and some of my figures, I'm going to use this owl to indicate the orientation of the script. The orientation of the Egyptian hieroglyphic could be either right to or left. You can track the orientation by looking at the anthropomorphic figures like people and birds, mainly birds. If they face to the right, then a text is oriented to the right. If they face to the left, then a text is oriented to the left. Now, the usual reading direction is opposite the orientation. So as you can see here, if you have a text oriented to the right, you read to the left, right to left, which is what this arrow highlights. Now, hieroglyphic wasn't just written next to images, it could create a kind of visual space of its own. And the way it was laid out had some principles. So on the most basic level, they would try to arrange individual signs into quadrats, which are these squares. As you can see, they try to minimize empty space. So here are all the different ways this single line of text is arranged into quadrats. So for example, look at 11 here, two short signs and a tall sign are arranged like this to minimize empty space. Another important principle of how these quadrats themselves are arranged into longer texts is symmetry. So you can see on this door lintel, it's the exact same inscription twice, but the orientation is reversed. It faces to the right here, and it faces to the right here and to the left here. And it creates kind of this symmetrical composition. Another very important principle is concordance, which is when you align the orientation of a given piece of text with the image that it accompanies. So for example, this composition here, it contains this sentence, which means scrubbing of the statue by two workmen. As you can see, the word for statue, which is in the middle of the sentence itself, gets taken out of the sentence and put above the statue and is oriented in the same direction to the right as the statue. Meanwhile, the rest of the sentence is reduplicated and the two workmen facing each other, the reduplicated sentence matches the orientation of the workmen themselves. So retrograde writing basically is the reversal of the usual reading direction. So if you look at the arrow and the owl here, usually, as I said, you would be reading into the signs, so right to left. However, in this case, as you can see on the arrow, we start on the left and we go to the right. It could either be arranged in columns or rows. We'll see some examples of rows later on. But columnar retrograde was by far the most common. And it was actually quite simple to compose because you wouldn't be reversing the signs in the individual quadrats themselves. You'd just be reversing the order of the columns. So as you can see, within this quadrat itself, you still read from right to left, but the columns themselves are read left to right. So it's a very simple operation, both to read and compose a text like this. You merely need to reverse where you start laying out the columns. Now, previous explanations of retrograde writing, I just brought three of the most popular here. One of them focuses on retrograde writing as it is used in underworld literature or funerary texts. It says that there is something within the content of these texts themselves, such as the circular nature of the sun or the reverse nature of the underworld. And then this somehow leads to retrograde writing through some unclear mechanism. Another explanation is that since hieratic, the more cursive script, is always oriented to the right, people would be using hieratic models to write texts, and they would try to keep the orientation. And it's actually the explanation usually presents this as a copying error, so they would keep the orientation of the original papyrus. Or retrograde writing could be a kind of cryptography, supposedly, which is supposed to enhance the mystery of the text by making it more difficult to read and then limiting access to these texts. However, I have a few problems with these explanations. First of all, on a very basic level, the philosophy of this explanation seemed to be that writing is something that is supposed to convey linguistic meaning purely. And so either retrograde writing somehow conveys the meaning of the text, or it's maybe an obstruction to reading, either deliberately through cryptography or accidentally through faulty copying. Another problem is that these explanations fail to account for the vast majority of the corpus. So, for example, I mentioned that the first class of explanations can exclusively only be used for funerary literature. But if we look at the actual corpus of retrograde writing, we can see that the genres and the media that retrograde writing uses is much more common. And as you can see, this kind of all of the previous explanations fail when we look at the corpus more broadly, because how do we explain, say, a theological hymn in terms of the reverse nature of the underworld? Or how do we look at how do we explain retrograde writing as faulty copying from a right-oriented hieratic original, when a lot of the time retrograde writing is oriented to the left? So the visual explanation I propose instead sees retrograde writing as a consequence of the visual principles of hieroglyphic script. So let's look at an example. If you'll recall the principle of concordance, where a text attached to a figure has to accompany said figure in its orientation, you can see that play out in this stela. So these two lines refer to the god here, and these three lines refer to the owner of the stela here, called Alf and Mul. As you can see, since these signs are oriented to the left, they are read left to right, as you would usually read them. However, these two columns are read left to right, which means only these two columns are retrograde. This, first of all, highlights the selective use of retrograde writing within a single composition. But it also shows that there is not a very mysterious reason here for the use of retrograde writing. They merely wanted to make sure that this sentence, which goes from here to here, is legible in a comprehensive way. Because if we didn't have retrograde writing in the first two columns, you would have to start reading here, read right to left, jump back over, and read left to right. Clearly, if we didn't use retrograde writing here, that would be more a kind of cryptography than using it, if anything. So keep in mind that I think most usually retrograde writing is reconciles concordance with the optimal reading or writing direction. Now, my first case study is the very famous Book of the Dead, and I am here using the Book of the Dead of Ani from the British Museum, which is probably one of the longest examples of the Book of the Dead. So the Book of the Dead itself is laid out in a scroll, unrolled from left to right. And at the beginning and the end are very certain vignettes enclosed. This is probably the most famous one, The Weighing of the Heart. And this is read in a completely usual manner. So this is Ani and his wife, and the text associated with them is oriented to the right like them. And you read it prograde, so as you usually would. Meanwhile, the text associated with the gods, you read as you usually would. So there is nothing strange about this, but most of the text itself, between the introductory and ending vignettes, is a series of spells or utterances which go from left to right. Again, you can see why we have the left to right orientation, because the main figures, the protagonists of the whole visual textual composition themselves, Ani and the wife, always face to the right, and they proceed to go over different events, they proceed to meet different entities. But the orientation keeps with them. If you look at the birds, they are oriented to the right. However, these texts, which make up the majority of this Book of the Dead, are read left to right, that is retrograde. And you can see it. You can kind of follow the logic of the person who was composing this. Because again, if we didn't use retrograde writing here, it would be mixing up either the reading order or it would be abandoning the orientation. So, as I said, this is a kind of flood of different utterances introduced usually in red. Utterances could start in the middle of the line. Utterances could start at the very end and cross over to the beginning of the line. So they are all written out one after each other. If we try to do this in prograde, the scribe would have to very accurately estimate where he's starting to lay out a spell on the right, and then would have to go very accurately like this. And that would either amount to gaps in between the spells, or it would amount to text flowing over into previous text. So the very simple solution to that is to make the whole composition retrograde. And then you can keep the concordant orientation while keeping a very fluid and comfortable reading and writing order. However, this is not as, it goes even further in the case of the Book of the Dead. There is the so-called chapter 151, which is an illustration of three-dimensional space. So the burial chamber itself. As you can see, the deceased is in the middle, and there are all these kind of symbolic entities which represent different cardinal directions. So, for example, Isis represents the north, while Nephthys represents the south. This figure represents the western horizon. This entity represents the eastern horizon. What you need to take away here is basically you can see that it's a symmetrical composition. So on the two sides, you always find opposing cardinal directions. And you can also see that the orientation, as the rest of this central section of the Book of the Dead, is always left to right. Well, maybe with the exception of this, where it's top to bottom, I guess. But I think that was probably composed by rotating the papyrus 90 degrees. So those should probably still be taken as oriented to the right. However, the reading direction is switched up to show kind of the opposition of the directions. So on the left, you have exclusively prograde writing, and on the right, you have retrograde writing. Thus, you can see how the opposition in orientation here is shown purely through the reading direction, while the concordant orientation of the text, following how we saw previously, is kept. So, as we could see, the Book of the Dead of Ani consists of both retrograde and prograde writings, which are selectively used. This allows us to follow the logic of the composition itself and see that retrograde writing is used in the central sections to lay out the text both in concordance with the main characters, Ani and his wife, and to also preserve an ideal and smooth reading order. My second case study is the Book of the Amduat in the Tomb of Amenhotep II. The text itself consists of 12 hours, I think Jordan already showed you an image from the text yesterday, which are arranged in a circle like this, going in a circle in the burial chamber of the king from the first to the 12th hour. As such, the text has a very definite directionality, which very clearly influences how it's laid out visually. And similarly to the Book of the Dead, it combines pro and retrograde writing in a way where we can follow the logic of the layout of the text. So this is one example of the Book of the Amduat, the 5th hour from the tomb of Amenhotep II. And most of it is in retrograde, as you can see these columns. But here we actually get an example of retrograde in a row or in a horizontal arrangement. Like these figures, who are facing, of course, left to right, they are pulling the sun bark, and the caption describing them is oriented to the right. However, as I said, the composition itself goes left to right. So the reading order is also left to right. So this is taken as retrograde. However, we do find prograde writing in the instances where a piece of text very rarely faces to the left. For example, the caption accompanying these snakes, which face to the left, faces to the left. However, it's read left to right in the usual prograde direction, which shows that the main object here was not retrograde writing itself, but rather guiding the eye of the viewer from the left to the right. And they would be happy to write prograde if the text is already oriented to the left, and thus it doesn't need to be reversed. So the conclusions for the Amduat are very similar to the Book of the Dead, because it's also a composition which combines prograde and retrograde writing. It comes from the directionality of the text, as you could see, the figures going left to right from one hour to the next. And again, the practice could hardly be explained in some mysterious element, because as you can see, if anything, retrograde writing helps the text to be laid out and read in a smooth manner. And if the retrograde writing was supposed to represent the reverse nature of the underworld, there would be very little purpose there would be no explanation to the occasional use of prograde writing. Before I conclude, I would like to introduce to you my favorite example of retrograde writing, which is this ostrakon or potshard, which contains a student exercise. As you can see, it's somewhat clumsily written. And it's a version of the Kemit, which was a text used for students. And as you can see, the text begins in column 1. The text itself faces to the right. And it goes in the usual prograde direction, as you would expect. However, you can kind of follow the logic of the student as they were writing, and they reached the left edge of the ostrakon. And of course, they wanted to continue their exercise because they must have been a very keen student. So they took what they had left over on the right and wrote 2 more columns, sticking to where they started in the first column. And these 2 columns are in retrograde. So clearly the student wasn't trying to resort to cryptography or explain anything about the underworld here. Clearly, what's happening here is that retrograde writing is a natural consequence of how hieroglyphs can be oriented both to the right and to the left, and how you write them kind of as images, making them not only very easy to reverse, but very easy to reverse, especially when you use columns like this. So it's kind of a very fluid and flexible feature of hieroglyphic writing, which should probably be usually explained either through pragmatic purposes like this or through looking at the broader visual composition. Thank you very much.